Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Salem. I am Brennan Norville, your celebrant today. We welcome Reverend Mark Gallagher back to our pulpit today. Look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. In its brief course lie all the verities and realities of your existence, the bliss of growth, the glory of action, the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is but a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But today, well lived, makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day.
Our gathering hymn today is Be That Guide. It's number 124 in the gray hymnal. Be that guide whom love sustains, rise above the daily strife, lift on high the good you find, help to heal the hurts of life. Be that helper nothing daunts, doubt of friend or taunt of foe, ever strive for liberty, show the path that life should go. Be that builder trusting good, bitter though the test may be, through all ages they are right, though they build in agony. Be that teacher faith directs, move beyond the old frontier, though the frightened fear that faith be tomorrow's pioneer.
I believe in prophecy. Some folks see things not everybody can see. Once in a while they pass a secret along to you and me. And I believe in miracles, something sacred burning in every bush and tree. We can all learn to sing the songs the angels sing. And I believe in God, God ain't me. I've traveled around the world, stood on mighty mountains and gazed across the wilderness. Never seen a line in the sand or a diamond in the dust. And as our fate unfurls, every day that passes I'm sure about a little bit less. Even my money keeps telling me it's God I need to trust. And I believe in God, God ain't us. God in my little understanding, don't care what name I call. Whether or not I believe doesn't matter at all. I receive the blessings. Every day on earth's another chance to get it right. Let this little light of mine shine and rage against the night. Just another lesson. Maybe someone's watching and wondering what I got. Maybe this is why I'm here on earth, and maybe not. But I believe in God. God is God. Oh, I believe in God. God is God.
This is the mission of our faith, to teach the fragile art of hospitality, to revere both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to witness to all that we must hold the whole world in our hands. Let us join together and say our affirmation. Love is our doctrine, compassion is our way. Here we seek to create a joyful home for free religious exploration, build a community of caring fellowship, nurture the hopes, and serve the needs of our world. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us. Each week, we light 3 chalices. The first is for this congregation, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Salem. We light our second chalice for our partner church in Sheeman Falva, Transylvania, Romania. And we light our third chalice for our children and youth in lifespan religious education and in our world at large. Let us sing the flame into life.
Rise up, O flame, by thy light glowing, show to us beauty, vision, and joy. Each week we practice exercising our capacity for compassion. I invite you now to bring to mind someone you know who is suffering in some way. And consider the particular qualities of their suffering. How is it they are suffering? And regard this person with mercy and goodwill. In your imagination, picture loving kindness flowing from you to them. Wish them relief from their distress. We also practice awakening gratitude in our hearts. I invite you now to become aware of some things in your life that merit gratitude. Savor these things in your mind for a moment and watch genuine appreciation arise in your heart.
If you have joys or concerns that you want to share and have read during our services, please visit our website and hit the Joys and Concerns button.
Our pastoral hymn today is Vine and Fig Tree. It's number 399 in the gray hymnal.
And everyone neath a vine and fig tree shall live in peace and unafraid. And everyone neath a vine and fig tree shall live in peace and unafraid. And into plowshares turn their swords, nations shall learn war no more. And into plowshares turn their swords, nations shall learn war no more.
Realize that for every ongoing war and religious outrage and environmental devastation and bogus Iraqi attack plan, there are thousands of counterbalancing acts of staggering generosity and humanity and art and beauty happening all over the world right now on a breathtaking scale from flower to cathedral. Resist the temptation to drown in fatalism, to shake your head and sigh and throw in the karmic towel.
What is this world coming to? It's not a question, but a lament. Disbelief and outrage at the world, and especially at the direction it's heading. Look at the world today. It's all going down the tubes. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. We never learn. Humanity is a cancer, a virus, a plague. When we shake our head and say something like this, we don't think we're flirting with controversy. It more or less goes without saying that the world is terrible and getting worse, fast. I call it the Great Lament. The Great Lament is a widespread sentiment. I don't doubt that many or most of you often feel that way. Time magazine marked it with a big yellow highlighter on its cover, declaring 2020 to be the worst year ever. Now, there can be no doubt that many sufferings and injustices in the world continue into the present, and there are a great many grave dangers which loom over our future. But surely none of us think that in the past there were not also plenty of sufferings and injustices. Before we pronounce that the world is racing toward hell, we ought to try to gauge the trajectory of the world. Despite having often engaged in the Great Lament myself, for many years I have, in my more reflective moments, reckoned that the human social order has, in important ways, actually been tending toward the good. This somewhat vague reckoning has been given detail and strength by the work of Steven Pinker, a Harvard cognitive psychologist. Assembling data of many kinds, Pinker presents a strong case that over recent decades and centuries, we have seen vast improvements in the human condition, not just for ruling elites, but for the masses the world over. The general trend of human well-being has been up definitively, though not in all ways, for all people, everywhere, all the time. This constitutes progress. This progress has not been an inevitable force of history, but is the result of efforts and choices, some of which we can put our finger on, and some of which we can only suppose. And the improved world which we inherit is not the end of the story. Suffering and injustice still exist and merit our concern. But it's important to know that humanity has lived through great sufferings in the past, and that by virtue of creativity and effort, despite enormous failings and setbacks, the human condition has been demonstrably improving, and not a little, a lot. What happens from this point with regard to the remaining problems of our world and the new ones arising depends on what we do. Now, because this is a lot to unpack, I'll address it in 2 sermons. Today we'll look at just one arena, an important one, violence. Next Sunday, we'll consider other aspects of human well-being like longevity, health, prosperity and poverty, rights and dignity, and other quality of life factors. Now, when it comes to looking at violence over time, it's important to look not at the aggregate amount of it, but the rate. There are many, many more people than there used to be. Our concern about violence is not that there is more of it just because there are more people. Our concern is the likelihood that violence will befall one of us. That is what indicates whether our world is becoming more violent or less so. In his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Steven Pinker makes an evidence-backed case that human society has, contrary to the ever-spiraling violence narrative, become dramatically less violent and brutal over decades and over centuries. My remarks here are largely drawn from Steven Pinker's work, but not uncritically. I present to you here only ideas that seem solid to me after 5 years of reflection, plus material from other sources. On the one hand, common knowledge tells us that the past was far more violent and brutal than today. To illustrate, the Christian Old Testament, while certainly containing many fictitious elements, is considered a fairly accurate description of life in the Mediterranean region about the year 1000 BCE. And as Pinker puts it, it is one long celebration of violence. We are told of a long string of wars of conquest, each of which concludes with the wholesale execution of all adult males, and either the rape and enslavement of the women and children, or else the execution of them as well. And this is not presented as a terrible thing which good people condemn, but as something that God commands and approves. For many nonviolent crimes like adultery or violation of dietary taboos, the biblically prescribed punishment was death or dismemberment. And this is the record of a people who believed they were introducing the world to a better way of life. While this is not exactly hard data, it leaves us with the sense that the ancient world was a place of ghastly violence and brutality, which other ancient accounts do tend to confirm. The Roman Colosseum is famous for being the site of grisly popular entertainments centered around battles to the death and prisoners being ripped apart by wild animals. crucifixion is famous to us as the manner in which Jesus was put to death. But this form of torture murder was widely practiced throughout the Mediterranean. The crucifix and its gentler cousin, the cross, were adopted as the primary symbols of the worldwide Christian faith. And while we're on the subject, it's worth noting that the early Christians were outraged not by petty criminals being subjected to this monumental cruelty, but by the fact that Jesus was treated as a petty criminal. It says something about the moral standards of the day, the casual acceptance of violence and brutality. The medieval period is practically synonymous with gruesome torture for robbery, heresy, hunting on the king's land, and so forth. Witnessing the enactment of these tortures, as well as simple beheading, was a popular public spectacle. And despite these terrorizing measures, one could not walk a medieval city at night without a sizable armed guard, even more so the medieval countryside. Even well into modern times, capital punishment remained common, though restricted to only the worst crimes. Cockfighting and cat burning were routine forms of low-brow entertainment not long ago. Even refined gentlemen settled challenges to their honesty or reputation by dueling with pistols. The discipline of children could legitimately include beating them with a stick as thick as one's thumb, the rule of thumb. Take them out back of the woodshed. All this being common knowledge, it seems obvious that in the past, especially the distant past, gruesome violence and brutality were taken for granted, not considered a big deal. Whereas the same sorts of things today are shocking and usually illegal. In this day and age, we have become far, far more sensitive to violence and intolerant of it. We display far more mercy and empathy toward those outside our family and clan, and even toward our own children. On TV, contemporary political leaders piously proclaim, "Such violence has no place in our world," which acknowledges that it was a normal feature of the past, but today we have much higher standards and will not tolerate it. And yet, somehow, we still manage to nod and agree that violence today is spiraling to new heights. A claim that violence has been in decline is reflexively met with an indignant, "Don't you read the newspaper?" We have a sense that the past was far more violent, yet somehow hold to the idea that today is even more violent. It doesn't add up, of course, but we seem to be okay with the idea that there was more violence in the past, as long as we also say that there's more in the present. Why is that? Why is there such resistance to the notion that violence is decreasing? First of all, where do we get our information about the world? Well, there's the news. Out of the myriad things that happen in the world, those things are deemed newsworthy, which are exceptional, not commonplace. Events which evoke fear and anger. If it bleeds, it leads. War and violent crime meet the bill. Unlike our grandparents, we hear about and even see images of atrocities from distant continents on a daily basis. What do we never hear about? The killing that didn't happen. As long as violence has not been completely eliminated, each instance of it makes better news than a downward statistical trend. Besides the news, we're exposed to the hyper-violent world of TV and movies, crime and war dramas, terrorist scenarios, sadistic villains, and so forth. In fiction, as well as in the news, violence attracts viewership. And even though we know it's fiction, still, we have seen it and we have felt it. Vivid depictions of violence color our imaginations, and I believe contribute to our exaggerated sense of how violent the world is. Furthermore, anti-violence advocates are rightly focused on the current problem rather than on past improvements. And no one ever generated support by saying, the problem we're looking at is getting smaller. So activist communications are almost always designed to elicit alarm. And when it comes to forming generalized impressions about the world from this highly skewed information that we've got coming in, there are various cognitive biases which further distort our picture. There's basic nostalgia. Our vivid impressions of contemporary violence stand in contrast to the hazy, selective memory of our innocent youth. There's what's called the availability heuristic. We tend to estimate the frequency of an event by the ease with which it comes to mind. The most easily remembered is taken as representative. What kinds of things are easily remembered? Hence, our vastly disproportionate fear of shark attacks and plane crashes. There is the negativity bias. It's a psychological fact that generally we dread losses more than we look forward to gains. And we dwell on setbacks more than we savor good fortune. Also, prior to World War I, there was this powerful idea called the myth of progress. The notion that scientific discovery, innovation, and social reform had become an inevitable force of history. The large-scale horrors of World War I made that idea an embarrassment. It became fashionable, I think, to overcompensate for naive optimism by adopting what I would call naive pessimism. And I think that holds true today. No one wants to be a Pollyanna. All these factors contribute to an overly pessimistic assessment of the state of our world and the direction it's heading. To illustrate, almost every year between 1990 and 2015, a majority of Americans told pollsters that crime was rising, even though during that period, violent crime in the United States was in reality plummeting, reduced by about half. But people said it was increasing. That was their impression. Now, one place to start in assessing the historical trajectory of violence is with the idea that we are an innately aggressive species. A few years ago, a massive study by Jose Maria Gomez showed that there is something to that. but it gives a twist to the significance of that statement. Gomez examined 1,000 species for the rates of killing within the species, what we might call murder. No, humans are not the only ones who do that, not by a long shot. He found that most often species exhibit rates of violence similar to those of their close evolutionary relatives, and that primates, our closest relatives, are the most violent of all groups, with 5 of the 6 most violent species in terms of violence within the species. Homo sapiens is not one of those, by the way. Primates, it seems, are highly social and highly territorial. Both of those features tend to precipitate violence within a species. So it's not surprising that primates rank high. Just think of it. If you are a territorial animal, but you live together in bunches, there's bound to be a lot of friction. Gomez also studied 600 human populations from 50,000 years ago to the present, using archaeological evidence, of course, for the older samples, and found that our hunter-gatherer ancestors exhibited levels of violence right in line with other animals of our type. I don't know about you, but I don't condemn animals for being what they are. And we are animals. Human violence did then increase, at least several-fold, in the ancient and medieval world of warring chiefdoms and kingdoms, with tribal raiding on the outskirts and brutal social norms predominating. You know the phrase, cut off your nose to spite your face? That's from the once common practice of cutting off someone's nose in revenge for an insulting remark. Not even a crime back in the day. But from around the 13th century onward, social changes began bringing down the rates of violence. Manuel Eisner did a major study of homicide rates in European countries over the centuries, using homicides per 100,000 per year as its measure. Around the year 1300, we see a high of 80 in Italy and a low of 30 in England. Each century, those rates slid down across all the countries in the study, until by 1900, we see a high of not 80, but 5. And a low of not 30, but 1. Roughly speaking, a decline of about 95%. Today, all of Western Europe and China, Taiwan, Japan, and other highly developed nations hover at or below that lowest figure, 1 per 100,000. The, in some ways, less civilized United States comes in at about 5. To what are we to attribute the dramatic diminution of interpersonal violence? One salient fact is that there was a great consolidation of political units, baronies, kingdoms, and so forth. Around the year 1400, there were in Europe about 5,000 political units. By 1600, there were just 500. In the early 1800s, 200, and in 1950, 30. Tremendous consolidation of political units and expansion of their territories. Unification of their territories, you might say. These political units transformed gradually from mere monarchical tyrannies to legitimate states with laws and judicial systems. They began to assert a monopoly on violence, the idea that only the state could legitimately kill and apply force. Previously, interpersonal violence had been a private matter. The disincentive was that the victim's kin might seek revenge. Because of this, clans had a powerful motive to pursue revenge as a sort of credible deterrence, as if to say, harm one of us and you risk retribution. Self-help justice, you might say. And good luck to you if your clan was weak or averse to violence. Under the legitimate nation state, violence became a crime against the state. The state would, however erratically, dispense justice and punish any who took matters into their own hands. Even while the state itself dispensed terrible violence, its enforced monopoly had the net effect of suppressing rates of violence overall. These legitimate states also began to provide the necessary conditions for trade, roads, currency, contracts, and the enforcement of contracts. By a trade, the ambitious could become wealthy through mutually profitable enterprises rather than by conquering lands or plundering laid-up stores. In trade relationships, even people in distant lands became more valuable alive than dead. One of the prime personal traits associated with violence is impulsivity, lack of self-restraint. Historians have noted the extreme lack of self-restraint which characterized life prior to modern times. This began to change. In 1530, the famed thinker Erasmus published, of all things, an etiquette manual called On Civility in Boys, which was a bestseller for 2 centuries. In what it counsels people not to do, we get a sense of what they were doing. Don't foul the staircases, corridors, closets, or wall hangings with urine or other filth. I wonder what he means by that. Don't blow your nose onto the tablecloth or in your hat. Don't fall on the food like a pig, snorting and smacking your lips, and so forth. Hundreds of these bits of advice. And Steven Pinker observes, these are the kind of directives you'd expect a parent to give a 3-year-old, not a great philosopher to a literate readership. Over time, this kind of encouragement did gradually elevate social behavior, and most importantly, with respect to violence, inculcate the capacity for self-restraint. While learning from an early age to restrain themselves in these rudimentary ways, people were also learning to restrain themselves from violent outbursts. Our tolerance for brutality and killing has diminished greatly in the past few centuries. And Pinker makes the case that a surprising contributor to this development has been an increase in perspective taking. Perspective taking. Imagining what the world looks and feels like from another's vantage point. The advent of fiction, memoir, and autobiography, together with rising literacy, opened windows into the lives of other people, including some quite different from oneself. Not only what they did and what happened to them, but what they thought and felt. We can hardly imagine what it would be like not to have been raised with lots of that. How different we would be without exposure to the interior life of others. Yet it's a pretty recent phenomenon. I can't prove it, but I think surely this greatly increases our sympathy toward others, makes us more reluctant to do them harm, engenders concern for their sufferings. The fiction of Charles Dickens made colorful and sympathetic protagonists of the downtrodden and even petty criminals. Harriet Beecher Stowe did so for the black slave in Uncle Tom's Cabin. This looking at the world from the vantage point of another led to many humanitarian social reforms, reducing violence and brutality. For one thing, the violence of the state against its own citizens, execution and horrendous torture, formerly just about universal, has in just the last 2 centuries been vastly diminished. In most countries, torture and capital punishment have been abolished. Even where they're still legal on the books, in practice they have become rare. Slavery, once widely practiced, is now outlawed in most countries, though some forms of it are still carried on illicitly on a much smaller scale. Child abuse and spousal abuse are still distressingly prevalent. We don't have reliable ways of assessing how this has changed over the centuries, as they were long considered none of anybody's business. But statistics indicate that these forms of violence in the United States have fallen by about half in recent decades. There may be underreporting, but I find it hard to imagine that that was less of an issue 50 years ago. And I have to say, intuitively, it seems domestic abuse was surely more common and more severe back when spare the rod, spoil the child was a common child-rearing adage, and when women promised to obey their husbands. And what about that horrible, large-scale violence we call war? We certainly have not seen the end of war, and yet we should not fail to notice that since the end of World War II, that's 76 years ago now, since the end of World War II, the major military powers, which had been averaging 2 wars a year since the year 1400, have engaged in 0 wars directly with one another. B, given that World War II came just 20 years after World War I, many assumed that by now there would have been a World War III, featuring the devastation of nuclear weapons. But as yet, you've surely noticed, there has been no World War III and no further use of nuclear weapons. Fingers crossed. And C, there have been 0 wars between any of the 44 most developed nations. War is no longer celebrated as it once was, to the chagrin of some. It's become a thing to be done reluctantly and somberly, a thing to decry, to call folly, to protest. The rate of just about all kinds of violence has fallen sharply over decades and centuries, far more sharply in some parts of the world than others. This diminution in violence is driven not by the simple march of time. It is the effect of structural changes in society and changes in human attitudes. The progress occurs only where the changes are made. It doesn't happen all over the world just because the calendar says it's a particular year. Consequently, in unstable or corrupt states like El Salvador, Brazil, Venezuela, the homicide rate per 100,000 is today in the 30 to 50 range, far above the 1 found in most stable developed countries, but still far below ancient and medieval rates. Where this progress has been achieved, there is no guarantee of its continuation. Violence can surge if the conditions which suppress it deteriorate. We are primates, the type of mammal most disposed by nature to violence against its own kind. Early versions of civilization amplified that disposition, but in recent centuries, something has enabled the better angels of our nature to gain the upper hand, to the point where we are now considerably less violent than pre-civilization humans. There are very legitimate debates to be had about what exactly has produced this less violent world and what will work best into the future. But wouldn't it be a tragic irony for us to be the beneficiaries of a violence reduction effort which has been spectacularly successful, and then abandon the project because we mistakenly think it's all failing miserably? With Steven Pinker, I believe the diminishment of violence is an indication that we have been doing something right, that we should get as clear as we can about what that is, and we should seek to do more of it. I'm also tremendously appreciative for what has been bequeathed to us and hope for an even better tomorrow for ourselves and all of our brothers and sisters. Having heard this message, I invite you now to dwell in your own experience. I invite you to close your eyes. And be conscious as you breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. Gently notice any thoughts which arise. Notice any feelings. In and out.
We support UUCS through our pledges, time, and connections with one another. We support the Salem community through donations to the Marion Polk Food Share, and for the month of August, Latinos Unidos Siempre, or LUS. LUS mission is to work towards the educational, cultural, social, and political development of Latino youth by empowering youth to take leadership roles in their community, advocating for social and political change, and combating racist stereotyping and discrimination through grassroots organization. Please send your checks to UUCS or visit the webpage to donate. Thank you for maintaining the community of UUCS and for helping the wider community of Salem.
Cuando el pobre nada tiene y no reparte, cuando alguien pasa sed y agua nos da, cuando el débil a su hermano fortalece, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. Va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. When at last all those who suffer find their comfort, when they hope, though even hope seems hopelessness, when we love, though hate at times seems all around us, then we know that God still goes that road with us. Then we know that God still goes that road with us. Cuando crece la alegría nos inunda, cuando dicen nuestros labios la verdad, cuando amamos el sentir de los sencillos, va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. Va Dios mismo en nuestro mismo caminar. When our homes are filled with goodness in abundance, when we learn how to make peace instead of war, when each stranger that we meet is called a neighbor, then we know that God still goes that road with us. Then we know that God still goes that road with us. Then we know that God still goes that road with us. Then we know that God still goes that road with us.
We take the light from our chalice, lighting the social justice lantern as a symbolic reminder of the light and justice that we carry out into the world. As we extinguish the chalices, let us hear these words from Martha Kirby Capo. Our time together is finished, but our work is not done. May our spirits be renewed and our resolve strengthened. as we meet the challenges of the week to come. This chalice flame is extinguished until we ignite it again with the spark of our communion. So right now the building is closed, and so we've paused registering for in-person coming to church. Connections groups begin in September, and it's just about time up to sign up. We are doing a trim and weed service September 5th. Used to be our Sparkle and Shine service, but we're going to be outdoors. We are doing the Zoom fellowship. After morning services, you can sign up and get the link. August 22nd through 28th, we'll be helping the homeless families. UUCS is scheduled to host the Family Promise, providing meals for 13 people, Sunday, Thursday, Saturday. Meals are delivered to one location. Family Promise team will be able to assist volunteers with cooking and meal delivery. And that is the new, RE, religious education, is canceled until September. Send questions to Director Lily Walker. All building use activities are canceled until further notice. The reopening team will continue to monitor metrics weekly and determine when to reopen our building.
Our closing hymn today is Far Too Long by Fear Divided. It's number 160 in the gray hymnal.
Far too long by fear divided, we have settled with the sword quarrels which should be decided by the reconciling word. Now the nations are united, though as yet in name alone, and the distant goal is sighted, which the prophet souls have shown. May at last we cease from warring, barriers of hate remove, and earth riches freely sharing, found the dynasty of love.
Let us imagine joining hands with our community members, guests, family, and friends, saying these words together. May faith in the Spirit of life, hope for the community of earth, and love for the sacred in one another be ours now and in all the days to come. Blessed be.